She never smiled. That's what the students whispered in the hallways of Jefferson High. Miss Caroline Warren, the literature teacher in room 304, the woman who arrived before dawn and left after dusk, who graded papers with a red pen that seemed to bleed across the page with the same precision she used to guard her heart. 47 years old, with silver threading through dark hair she wore in a tight bun, lines around her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and silent tears, a wardrobe of grays and blacks that matched the walls she'd built around herself. She never smiled, and perhaps that's why no one expected what happened next. Perhaps that's why no one saw it coming. The way darkness sometimes recognizes itself in another person, the way loneliness calls to loneliness across crowded rooms and empty parking lots. Perhaps that's why she didn't run the first time she saw him waiting by her car, leaning against a black Mercedes with tinted windows, a cigarette burning between his fingers, his eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her keys slip from her trembling hands. The Mafia boss who began waiting for her after school, every single day, until the woman who never smiled found herself doing something far more dangerous than smiling. She found herself wanting to. It started on a Tuesday in October, when the leaves were dying and the sky hung low and gray over the city like a shroud. Caroline had stayed late, as always, grading essays from her 11th grade class, students who wrote about dreams and futures, while she sat in a classroom that smelled of chalk dust and old books, wondering when her own dreams had calcified into routine. The fluorescent lights hummed above her, that persistent buzzing that matched the emptiness in her chest, and outside the windows the world grew dark without asking her permission. She was always the last one in the building, had been for 7 years, ever since her divorce from Thomas had finalized, and she'd realized that going home to an empty apartment felt worse than staying in an empty school. At least here, she had purpose. At least here, the silence felt earned rather than chosen for her. She gathered her papers at 8:15, the way she always did, tucked them into her worn leather satchel along with the thermos of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. Her footsteps echoed in the empty hallways, past lockers covered in homecoming posters and club announcements, past the gymnasium where a janitor pushed a mop across the gleaming floor, past the main office where the security lights cast long shadows across the trophy cases filled with victories that belonged to other people, other years, other versions of hope. The October air hit her face when she pushed through the heavy doors, cold and sharp, carrying the scent of rain that hadn't yet fallen. The parking lot stretched before her, mostly empty now, just a few scattered cars belonging to the night custodians and the football coach who lived in his office more than he lived at home. That's when she saw him. A man she didn't recognize, standing beside her Honda Civic, which suddenly looked small and pathetic next to the sleek black Mercedes parked deliberately, invasively close. He was tall, perhaps 6'2" or 6'3", wearing a dark suit that probably cost more than 3 months of her salary, his hair touched with gray at the temples, his face all sharp angles and shadows in the dim parking lot lights. He didn't move when he saw her notice him. Didn't straighten or apologize or explain. He simply watched her with eyes so dark they looked black. And there was something in that gaze that made her blood run cold and hot at the same time. Something that made every instinct scream at her to turn around, to go back inside, to call security, to do anything except keep walking toward him. But she was tired. So desperately tired of being afraid, of being careful, of being the woman who never smiled and never took risks and never, ever did anything that might crack the carefully constructed shell of her controlled existence. So she kept walking, her sensible shoes clicking against the asphalt, her keys now clutched between her fingers like a weapon, her heart hammering against her ribs so hard she thought he might be able to hear it across the distance between them. "Miss Warren," he said when she was close enough to hear, and his voice was like smoke, dark and curling, with an accent she couldn't quite place, something European mixed with years of American concrete and steel. He knew her name. This stranger in the parking lot of her school knew her name, and that fact settled into her stomach like a stone. "I've been waiting for you." She stopped 3 feet away, close enough to see the expensive watch on his wrist, the perfectly tailored cut of his suit, the way his hands looked both elegant and dangerous, like they could sign checks for millions or wrap around a throat with equal ease. Close enough to smell his cologne, something woody and dark that probably came in a black bottle with a French name. Close enough to see the scar that ran along his jawline, faint but present, a reminder that this man had survived something violent. "I don't know you," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she expected. The teacher voice she used on difficult students, the voice that said she would not be intimidated even when she was. "Please move away from my car." He smiled then, but it wasn't a kind smile. It was the smile of a predator who had cornered something small and fragile, except there was no cruelty in it, only a strange sort of recognition, as if he saw something in her that she'd been trying to hide. "My name is Aleksander Volkov," he said, and even in her fear, even in her confusion, she noticed how he pronounced each syllable with care, as if his name was both an introduction and a warning. "And you're right. You don't know me. But I know you, Caroline. I've been watching you for 3 months." The confession should have terrified her, should have sent her running back toward the school, screaming for help, fumbling for her phone to call the police. But there was something in the way he said it. Something that wasn't quite threat and wasn't quite promise. Something that sounded almost like an apology, and she found herself frozen, staring at this stranger who knew her name and admitted to watching her. This man who looked like he belonged in boardrooms or crime scenes, not high school parking lots in the suburbs where the biggest danger was usually someone's teenager learning to drive. "I'm calling the police," she said, reaching into her purse, but her hands were shaking now, betraying her calm facade, and she couldn't find her phone among the debris of tissues and pens and the emergency granola bars she kept for students who came to class hungry. "You could do that," Alexander said, and he finally moved, pushing himself away from her car with a fluid grace that suggested violence held in check, controlled danger, a storm choosing not to break. "The police know me. They know my name, my business, my reputation. They know exactly who I am and what I do. And they would come, Caroline, if you called them. They would take your statement. They would ask you questions. They would open an investigation into why a man like me is interested in a woman like you." He paused, letting those words sink in, and there was something heavy in them, something that suggested consequences she couldn't yet imagine. "Is that what you want? For them to start asking questions? For them to start looking into your life, your past, your secrets?" Her blood went cold. She had secrets. Everyone had secrets. Things from her marriage she'd never told anyone. Things about why Thomas had really left. Things about the nights she'd spent driving past his new house, watching the lights in the windows, counting the moments until she felt nothing. Things she'd written in journals she kept locked in her bedside drawer. Dark thoughts and darker wishes that no one was supposed to see. But how could this stranger know that? How could he possibly know that she had anything to hide? "What do you want?" she whispered. And she hated how small her voice sounded, how much like a victim, how much like someone who had already lost before the game even began. He studied her for a long moment, and in the harsh parking lot lights his face looked both beautiful and terrible, carved from marble and malice, and she couldn't tell if she was looking at a monster or a man or something in between. "I want to take you to dinner," he said finally, and the mundane nature of the request was so at odds with everything else that she almost laughed. Almost. "Tomorrow night, 8 o'clock, I'll pick you up." "I'm not going to dinner with you," she said, finding some steel in her spine, some remnant of the woman she used to be before life had beaten the fight out of her. I don't know you. You've admitted to stalking me. You've just threatened me. Why in God's name would I go anywhere with you? Because you're curious, he said simply, and the truth of it hit her like a slap. Because you've spent the last 7 years being safe and careful and alone, and part of you wants to know what happens if you say yes. Part of you wants to know why a man like me would wait in a parking lot for a woman like you. Part of you is already wondering what I saw when I watched you, what I noticed that no one else does. She wanted to argue, wanted to throw his observations back in his face, to prove him wrong, to demonstrate that she was perfectly fine with her safe, careful, alone existence. But the words stuck in her throat because he was right. God help her, he was right. She was curious, dangerously, stupidly curious about this man who stood in shadows and spoke in riddles and looked at her like she was something rare and valuable instead of something used up and discarded. I teach until 5, she heard herself say, and she couldn't believe the words were coming from her mouth, couldn't believe she was actually considering this insanity. I have papers to grade. I have lesson plans to prepare. I have a life, Mr. Volkov, one that doesn't include dinner with strangers who lurk in parking lots. 8 o'clock, he repeated, as if she hadn't spoken at all, as if her refusal was just a formality they both knew she didn't mean. He reached into his jacket and she tensed, half expecting a weapon, but he pulled out a business card, black with silver lettering that probably looked elegant in daylight but seemed ominous now. He held it out to her, waiting, and after a moment that felt like surrender, she took it. Their fingers brushed, and the contact was electric, sending a jolt through her system that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with something she thought had died in her years ago. Want. Pure, uncomplicated, dangerous want. If you decide not to come, I'll understand. But I'll be here tomorrow evening, Caroline, waiting by your car. Every evening after that. Until you're ready to have dinner with me, or until you call those police we discussed. Your choice. He walked away then, moving toward the Mercedes with that same controlled grace, and she stood frozen, watching him, the business card burning in her hand like evidence of a crime she hadn't yet committed. He opened the car door, slid inside, and the engine purred to life, expensive and powerful, and she wondered how many laws he'd broken to afford a car like that, how many lives he'd destroyed, how many people had stood where she was standing now and made the wrong choice. The Mercedes pulled away, its taillights like red eyes in the darkness, and she was alone again in the parking lot. Her car waiting, her empty apartment waiting, her safe and careful and alone life waiting for her to climb back into it and pretend this had never happened. But she couldn't pretend. Not anymore. Because Aleksander Volkov had seen something in her, something she'd thought was invisible, and now she couldn't unsee it either. The part of her that wanted more. The part that was tired of being careful. The part that wondered what it would feel like to let someone dangerous get close, to let someone who looked like sin and sounded like temptation pull her out of the gray monotony of her existence and into something vivid and terrible and real. She got in her car, drove home through streets that seemed darker than usual, through neighborhoods where lights glowed in windows, and families sat down to dinner and people lived lives that included other people. Her apartment greeted her with its usual silence, its beige walls and generic furniture, its complete lack of anything personal or passionate or alive. She made tea she didn't drink, opened a book she couldn't read, sat on her couch and stared at the business card that said simply, Aleksander Volkov, with a phone number and nothing else. No business name, no title, no indication of what he did or who he was, beyond those 3 syllables that carried weight like stones. She didn't sleep that night, kept thinking about the way he'd said her name, Caroline, like it was a secret between them, like he knew things about her that even she didn't fully understand. Kept thinking about his eyes, so dark and intense, seeing through her teacher armor to the lonely woman underneath. Kept thinking about his voice saying she was curious, and knowing deep in her bones that he was right. The next day at school felt surreal, like she was walking through someone else's life, teaching someone else's classes, grading someone else's papers. Her students noticed something different about her, asked if she was feeling all right, and she said she was fine with a smile that felt foreign on her face. She never smiled, but today she did, and it felt like betrayal of some unspoken rule she'd imposed on herself, some promise to remain untouchable and unmoved by the world around her. At 5 o'clock she left. Didn't stay late. Didn't grade papers or prepare lessons or hide in room 304 until the building emptied around her. She drove home in the afternoon light, changed into a dress she'd bought years ago and never worn, something dark blue that made her feel less invisible, less like a woman who had given up, and more like a woman who might have dinner with a dangerous man and survive the experience. She put on lipstick, took it off, put it on again, stared at herself in the mirror and tried to recognize the person looking back. The woman with scared eyes and trembling hands who was about to make either the best or worst decision of her life. At 7:45, she stood by her window, watching the street below, telling herself she could still back out, could still call him and cancel, could still choose safety over whatever madness this was. At 7:55, the Mercedes pulled up to her building, sleek and dark and impossible to ignore. At 8 o'clock exactly, her doorbell rang, and she felt her heart stop and restart, felt every nerve in her body light up with awareness and fear, and that terrible, wonderful sense of standing on the edge of something vast and unknowable. She opened the door. Aleksander Volkov stood in the hallway, wearing a different suit, charcoal gray this time, with a white shirt open at the collar, no tie, as if he'd decided formality could only go so far before it became a barrier. He held a single white rose, which seemed absurdly romantic given that he'd essentially coerced her into this dinner, and when he handed it to her, she noticed his hands were steady where hers had been shaking all day. "You came," he said, and there was something in his voice that sounded almost like relief, as if he'd genuinely believed she might not open the door, might leave him standing in her hallway like a fool. "I came," she confirmed, taking the rose because refusing it felt petty, felt like a defense she wasn't sure she wanted to maintain. "Though I'm still not entirely sure why." "Because you're brave," he said, and the compliment caught her off guard, because no one had called her brave in years, decades maybe, and she'd stopped thinking of herself as anything other than cautious and careful and quietly afraid. "Braver than you know. It takes courage to say yes to uncertainty, Caroline. Most people spend their whole lives saying no." She didn't know how to respond to that, so she didn't. Just grabbed her purse, locked her door, and followed him down the hallway to the elevator, feeling like she was walking toward either salvation or damnation, and couldn't quite tell which. In the elevator, they stood in silence, watching the numbers descend, and she was acutely aware of him beside her, the heat of his presence, the way he seemed to take up more space than his physical body required, as if danger and power had their own gravitational pull. The Mercedes was waiting, a driver behind the wheel, and Alexander opened the back door for her, ushering her inside with a gesture that was both chivalrous and commanding. The interior smelled like leather and money, everything dark and polished and expensive, and when he slid in beside her, she felt the weight of her decision settle around her shoulders like a cloak she couldn't remove. "Where are we going?" she asked as the car pulled away from her building, moving through city streets with the smooth confidence of someone who owned the roads, who didn't worry about traffic or lights or the normal rules that governed normal people. "Somewhere quiet," he said, Somewhere we can talk without interruption. You don't like crowds, do you, Caroline? Don't like noise and chaos and too many people competing for attention. It wasn't a question, and the accuracy of his observation made her skin prickle with unease. You said you'd been watching me for 3 months, she said, turning to face him, trying to read his expression in the dim interior of the car. Why? What could you possibly find interesting about a middle-aged schoolteacher who spends her evenings grading papers and her weekends reading books she's already read a dozen times? He was quiet for a moment, studying her with that intense gaze that made her feel exposed, vulnerable, like he could see all the broken pieces she'd tried so hard to hide. I saw you cry, he said finally, and his voice was so soft she almost didn't hear it over the sound of the car moving through the city. 3 months ago, I was at Jefferson High for a meeting with the principal, discussing a donation to the school's scholarship fund. Legitimate business, Caroline, nothing sinister. I saw you through the window of your classroom, sitting at your desk, your head in your hands, and you were crying. Not making a sound, just these silent tears running down your face, and there was something about it that broke something in me. Something about the way you cried like you'd done it so many times, you'd learned to do it quietly, so no one would hear, so no one would know. I stood there watching you, and I thought about walking in, asking if you were all right, but I didn't. I went to my meeting, made my donation, left. But I couldn't stop thinking about you, about that silent crying, about what kind of pain a person carries when they've learned to grieve without making noise. Caroline felt her throat tighten, felt the sting of tears she refused to let fall because she remembered that day. Remembered sitting at her desk after her ex-husband had called to tell her he was engaged again, getting married again, building a new life with someone younger and happier and more capable of smiling. She'd thought she was alone, had believed her pain was private, hidden, safe from the judgment and pity of the world. But Aleksander Volkov had seen her, had witnessed her breaking, and instead of looking away like most people did, he'd watched, had remembered, had come back. So you stalked me out of pity? She said, and there was an edge to her voice now, anger mixing with the vulnerability, because she didn't want his pity, didn't want anyone's pity, would rather be alone forever than be someone's charity case. Not pity, he said, and his hand moved, just slightly, like he wanted to reach for her, but stopped himself. Recognition. I know what it's like to cry in silence, Caroline. I know what it's like to build walls so high that no one can climb them, to convince yourself that safety is worth the loneliness, that it's better to feel nothing than to risk feeling everything. I saw myself in you that day, saw the person I would have been if I'd chosen a different path, if I'd buried myself in routine and duty instead of violence and power. And I thought, maybe if I could get to know you, could understand how someone chooses that kind of solitude, I might understand myself better, too. The car turned onto a private road, winding up through hills she didn't recognize, and she realized they'd left the city behind, were heading somewhere remote, somewhere isolated, and a fresh wave of fear washed over her. "Where are you taking me?" she demanded, her voice sharp with sudden panic. "This isn't a restaurant. This isn't anywhere public." "My home," Alexander said calmly, as if taking a woman he barely knew to his private residence was perfectly reasonable, perfectly safe, perfectly normal. "I told you I wanted somewhere quiet, somewhere we could talk without interruption. I have a chef who's prepared dinner for us, a security team who will ensure you're completely safe, and if at any point you want to leave, Caroline, if at any point you feel uncomfortable or threatened or simply change your mind, my driver will take you home immediately. No questions, no consequences. Just a quiet dinner in a quiet place with a man who wants to know you." She should have demanded to be taken home, should have told him this was insane, that taking her to his private estate was beyond inappropriate, was dangerous and reckless, and exactly the kind of thing that ended up on true crime podcasts, narrated by people who knew better. But there was something in his voice, something genuine and almost desperate, that made her pause. He'd called her brave, had said it took courage to say yes to uncertainty, and maybe she wanted to prove him right. Maybe she wanted to prove to herself that she could still do something reckless, still take a risk, still choose possibility over safety even when every logical part of her brain screamed warnings. "One dinner," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "And then, you take me home." "One dinner," he agreed, and there was relief in his voice again. That same strange vulnerability that didn't seem to fit with the dangerous man in the expensive suit. "Thank you, Caroline." The house appeared around a curve in the road, and calling it a house was like calling the ocean a puddle. It was a mansion, all stone and glass and architectural ambition, perched on a hillside with views of the city spread below like fallen stars. The gates opened automatically, and the Mercedes pulled up to an entrance where warm light spilled from tall windows, where everything looked both elegant and vaguely threatening, like money earned through means that didn't bear close examination. Alexander helped her from the car, his hand on her elbow steady and warm, and he led her inside to a foyer that could have held her entire apartment 3 times over. Marble floors reflected the chandelier overhead, a massive thing of crystal and light that probably cost more than she'd earn in her lifetime. Abstract paintings covered the walls, the kind that dealers sold for 6 figures to people who collected art as investments rather than passion. Everything was beautiful and cold and impersonal, like a showroom rather than a home, and she wondered if he even lived here, or if this was just another mask he wore, another wall he built between himself and the world. But then he led her through the formal spaces to a smaller room at the back of the house, all windows overlooking the lights below, and here things were different. Books lined the shelves. Real books with cracked spines and dog-eared pages, not decorator books chosen for their matching colors. A worn leather chair sat by the fireplace, a reading lamp beside it, and on the side table sat a pair of reading glasses and a bookmark, holding place in a Russian novel she recognized from her graduate school days. This was where he lived, she realized. This smaller room with its lived-in comfort was where the real Alexander existed when he wasn't playing the part of the dangerous man in the expensive suit. Dinner was served at a small table by the windows, just 2 place settings, intimate and carefully arranged. The food was exquisite, course after course of things she couldn't pronounce, but could taste the care in, the attention to detail, the desire to impress without overwhelming. And through it all, they talked. Not about his business, not about her divorce, not about the dangerous space between them, but about books. About the Russian authors they both loved, about the way Dostoevsky understood suffering, about how Tolstoy wrote families with such precision it hurt to read. She found herself relaxing, found the conversation flowing easier than it had with anyone in years, found that underneath the danger and the mystery, Aleksander Volkov was simply a man who read Russian literature and wore reading glasses and understood loneliness with the kind of intimacy that only came from experience. "Why the Mafia?" she asked finally, when coffee had been served and the night had deepened around them, when the wine had loosened her tongue just enough to ask the dangerous questions. "If you love books and literature, if you understand beauty and art, why choose violence? Why choose to be the thing that everyone fears?" He set down his coffee cup carefully, precisely, and for a moment she thought he wouldn't answer, would deflect or change the subject or remind her that they'd agreed not to discuss his business. But then he looked at her, really looked at her, and his eyes were so sad she almost gasped. "Because I was very good at it," he said quietly. "And because when you grow up in certain neighborhoods, in certain families, You don't choose your path so much as it chooses you. My father ran the organization before me, his father before him. I was raised to lead, to command, to make decisions that other men couldn't make. And by the time I was old enough to realize I might have wanted something different, I'd already done things that made different impossible. You can't undo violence, Caroline. You can't take back the decisions you made when you were young and stupid and believed that power was the same as worth. But you made that donation to the school, she said softly, thinking about what he'd told her, about how he'd been at Jefferson High for legitimate business. You're trying to do something different now. I'm trying, he agreed. Trying to build something that isn't just fear and power and violence, trying to find ways to give back to the city I've taken so much from. But it's complicated, Caroline. The people who work for me, they depend on me. The families who rely on the business, they need stability, protection. I can't just walk away, can't just decide one day to be someone else. But I can try to be better. Can try to use what I've built for something other than just more of the same. She understood that more than he knew. Understood trying to be better while carrying the weight of who you used to be. Understood the impossibility of complete transformation when the past clung to you like shadows. Is that why you wanted to know me? She asked. Because you think I've somehow managed to do what you can't? Because you think I've successfully buried my past and built something clean? No, he said, and he reached across the table, took her hand in his before she could pull away, and the contact sent electricity racing up her arm, dangerous and undeniable. Because I think we're both still trying, both still struggling with the people we were and the people we want to be. Both still crying in silence when we think no one's watching. And maybe, Caroline, maybe we don't have to try alone. She should have pulled her hand away, should have reminded him that this was just dinner, just one evening, just curiosity satisfied and nothing more. But his hand was warm and steady around hers, and she couldn't remember the last time someone had touched her with gentleness instead of necessity, with intention instead of accident. Couldn't remember the last time she'd felt seen, really seen, by another human being who looked at her and found something worth knowing. I can't do this, she whispered, but she didn't pull away, didn't move, just sat there with her hand in his, and her heart racing and her mind screaming warnings she couldn't quite bring herself to hear. I can't be whatever you think I might be. I'm just a school teacher, Alexander. I grade papers and teach books and go home to an empty apartment and pretend I'm fine with it. I don't know anything about your world, about violence and power and the things you've done. I wouldn't survive 5 minutes in that darkness. You've survived your own darkness for 7 years, he said, his thumb moving gently across her knuckles, the touch so tender it made her want to cry. You've survived divorce and loneliness and silent tears and convinced yourself you deserved all of it. That takes strength, Caroline. More strength than you give yourself credit for. And I'm not asking you to enter my world. I'm asking if maybe I can enter yours. If maybe you can teach me how to be the kind of person who reads books, without blood on his hands, who builds something without destroying something else first. I don't know how to do that, she said, and the confession felt like surrender, like admitting she was just as lost as he was, just as broken, just as desperate for something to fill the emptiness that had become her constant companion. Then maybe we figure it out together, he said, and his voice held something she hadn't expected to hear. Hope. Fragile, uncertain hope that maybe two damaged people could find something in each other that resembled healing, that resembled wholeness, that resembled the possibility of being something other than alone. He took her home at midnight, his hand steady on her lower back as he walked her to her door, his presence filling the hallway with heat and danger and something that felt terrifyingly close to belonging. At her door, he didn't try to kiss her, didn't push for more, just looked at her with those dark eyes that seemed to hold entire universes of pain and longing and carefully controlled need. "Can I see you again?" he asked, and the vulnerability in the question undid her completely, because this powerful, dangerous man was asking, not demanding, was giving her the choice, was respecting her enough to let her decide. "Yes," she heard herself say, even though every rational part of her brain screamed that this was madness, that getting involved with a man like Aleksander Volkov was professional suicide, personal disaster, an invitation to pain she couldn't begin to imagine. But the irrational part, the part that had been dormant for so long she'd thought it was dead, whispered that maybe pain was better than numbness, that maybe danger was better than safety if safety meant being alone forever. He smiled then, a real smile that transformed his face from hard angles and cold calculation into something almost boyish, almost innocent, and she realized he was handsome when he forgot to be dangerous. "Tomorrow?" he asked. "After school?" "Tomorrow," she agreed, and when he finally left, when she closed the door behind him and leaned against it, her heart pounding and her hands shaking and her mind racing with everything that had just happened, she realized she was smiling too. She never smiled, but tonight she did, and it felt like rebellion, like revolution, like the first crack in walls she'd spent years building. The next day, he was waiting by her car again, and the day after that, and the day after that. It became routine. This dangerous man in expensive suits standing in the parking lot of Jefferson High, waiting with patient intensity for a teacher who'd convinced herself she was invisible. Students started to notice, started whispering about Miss Warren and the mysterious man who picked her up every day, started speculating about secret relationships and forbidden romance, and all the dramatic narratives that teenagers constructed when reality offered them anything remotely interesting. The administration noticed, too. The principal called her into his office, asked carefully neutral questions about whether she felt safe, whether this man was causing any problems, whether she needed help. She assured him everything was fine, that Alexander was a friend, nothing inappropriate, nothing concerning. But she could see the worry in his eyes, could see him making calculations about liability and scandal, and what it meant for the school's reputation if one of their teachers was involved with someone like Aleksander Volkov, whose name carried weight in certain circles, whose business dealings were never quite illegal, but never quite legal either. She should have been more careful, should have asked him to pick her up somewhere else, somewhere less visible, somewhere that wouldn't put her job at risk. But there was something about his public claiming of her attention that made her feel significant, made her feel chosen, made her feel like someone worth waiting for even when the waiting was inconvenient or complicated or risky. Their dates fell into a pattern: quiet dinners at his house, long conversations about books and art and the spaces between who they were and who they wished they could be. He never pressured her, never pushed for physical intimacy beyond holding her hand or touching her face with a gentleness that seemed at odds with everything else about him. It was a courtship, old-fashioned and careful, as if he understood that she needed needed time to adjust to the idea of letting someone close after years of keeping everyone at a comfortable distance. But the danger was always there, hovering at the edges of their careful bubble. The night his phone rang during dinner and his face went cold became the face of the man who ran an empire built on fear, and he excused himself, and she could hear him speaking Russian in low, hard tones that promised consequences she didn't want to imagine. The evening he showed up at her door with bruised knuckles and a split lip, he wouldn't explain, just asked if he could sit with her for a while, if she could read to him from one of her books, if she could remind him that there were things in the world besides blood and money and the constant negotiation of power. The morning she opened her car and found a single black rose on her windshield with a note that said simply, "Stay away from him or you'll regret it," in harsh block letters. And when she showed it to Alexander, something in his eyes went dark and terrible, and he made a phone call in that same cold voice and promised her no one would threaten her again. And no one did. The note stopped. The whispers in the hallways changed from concern to curiosity, to a strange kind of acceptance, as if the school had collectively decided that Miss Warren's mysterious boyfriend was just another quirk of their dedicated literature teacher. Like her refusal to use technology, or her habit of bringing in homemade cookies for students who stayed after class for help. Life continued. Routine reasserted itself, and Caroline found herself settling into this strange new normal where she taught Hemingway by day and had dinner with a Mafia boss by night, where she graded papers in his library while he took phone calls about shipments and territories and problems that needed solving, where she fell asleep on his couch while he read Russian poetry aloud in a voice that turned violence into music. But the fear never fully left. Fear of what he was, what he'd done, what he might do. Fear of the age difference that made her feel ancient and fragile next to his dangerous vitality. Even though he was 14 years younger at 33. Even though he treated her like something precious rather than something old, like the age gap was irrelevant compared to what they had found in each other. Fear of the different worlds they came from, her realm of books and careful words and the belief that education could save people. His realm of power and carefully calculated violence, and the knowledge that sometimes salvation came through force. Fear that she was falling in love with him, deeply and irrevocably in love, and that love like this could only end in heartbreak or worse, could only end with her destroyed by proximity to his dangerous world. 3 months into their careful courtship, everything changed. It was a Friday evening in January, winter settling hard over the city, and Caroline had stayed late at school working on semester grades. Alexander was picking her up at 7, taking her to some charity gala where he needed to make an appearance, maintain his legitimate businessman facade, show the world that he was more than just rumors and carefully buried secrets. She'd bought a dress for the occasion, something elegant and age-appropriate, something that would help her feel less like an imposter in his world of money and power and people who smiled with shark teeth. She was gathering her things when her classroom door opened. Not Alexander. A man she didn't know. Young and hard-eyed, with a gun tucked into his waistband where she could see it. Where she was meant to see it and understand what it implied. "Miss Warren," he said, his voice flat and professional, like a businessman conducting an unpleasant transaction. "I need you to come with me. Mr. Volkov has asked that I bring you to him immediately." Every instinct screamed danger. Alexander had told her early on that if anyone ever approached her claiming to be from him, she should call him first. Verify. Never just go. He'd given her a number, made her memorize it, made her promise she'd use it if she ever felt threatened. She reached for her phone, but the man moved faster, grabbed her wrist hard enough to bruise, hard enough to make her gasp. "I don't think so," he said. "Phone stays here. You come with me. Now. Unless you want me to make this difficult." She went. What choice did she have? He walked her out through the empty school, past the janitors who looked away when they saw the gun, past the security guard who suddenly found his paperwork fascinating, out into the parking lot where a dark SUV waited with its engine running. She was pushed into the back seat, hands zip-tied behind her, and she thought about Alexander waiting for her at 7, showing up to an empty parking lot, finding her car still there and her gone, and she wondered if he'd know what it meant, if he'd find her before whatever was about to happen, happened. The SUV drove through the city, taking streets she didn't recognize, heading toward the industrial district where factories stood empty and warehouses held secrets that normal people didn't ask about. They pulled into one of those warehouses, vast and dark and cold. And she was pulled from the vehicle, marched through shadows and past men with guns who watched her with eyes that held no mercy, no humanity, just the cold calculation of people who'd stopped caring about consequences. In the center of the warehouse, under harsh lights that turned everything stark and unforgiving, a man waited. Older than Alexander, with silver hair and a face that had forgotten how to smile decades ago. He sat in a chair that looked absurdly normal in this industrial nightmare, drinking what looked like expensive scotch from a crystal glass, and when he saw her, he smiled without warmth. "Miss Caroline Warren," he said, his accent thick, Russian maybe, or something Eastern European that carried old-world brutality in every syllable. "The schoolteacher who has captured the attention of Aleksander Volkov. I've been curious about you, trying to understand what he sees in you, why he would risk so much for a woman who offers him nothing in terms of power or position or strategic advantage." She said nothing. Fear had locked her throat, had turned her voice into something small and useless, and all she could think was that Alexander had warned her this might happen, that getting close to him meant becoming a target, a weakness, a weapon his enemies could use against him. "I am Viktor Kozlov," the man continued, setting down his scotch with precise deliberation. "And Aleksander Volkov has taken something from me. Territory, money, respect. Things I cannot allow to go unanswered, so I'm going to take something from him. Not kill you, that would be too quick, too merciful, but hurt you. Hurt you badly enough that he understands the cost of crossing me, the price of thinking he can operate without consequence." The man who'd taken her from the school moved forward, and she saw him reach for something at his belt, something that glinted metal and sharp, and she thought, "This is it. This is how it ends." Crying in silence in a warehouse because I was stupid enough to fall in love with danger. The warehouse door exploded inward, not opened, exploded, the metal shrieking as something punched through it with massive force. Men shouted, guns raised, and through the smoke and chaos, Aleksander Volkov walked with the measured calm of a hurricane given human form. He held a gun in each hand, and his face was something out of nightmares, all cold rage and calculated murder. Every bit the dangerous man she'd been trying not to see when he looked at her with gentle eyes and spoke about books. What happened next was violence. Pure, efficient, brutal violence. Alexander moved through Victor's men like they were paper, like they were nothing, and she couldn't look away even though every civilized part of her wanted to, even though watching him kill was watching him reveal the truest part of himself, the part he'd been so careful to keep hidden from her. Bodies fell, blood sprayed. And through it all, he never hesitated, never showed mercy, never paused until he stood before Viktor Kozlov with both guns pointed at the older man's head. "You touched her," Alexander said, and his voice was something dead, something cold beyond cold, something that promised suffering beyond what quick death could provide. "You put your hands on her, threatened her, used her against me. That was your last mistake, Victor. Your last breath should be spent understanding that." "You can't kill me," Victor said, but there was fear in his voice now, real fear breaking through the bravado. "The council won't allow it. There are rules, Alexander. Even for you." "I don't care about the council," Alexander said softly. "I don't care about rules. I care about her. And you hurt what I care about. So yes, Victor, I can kill you. I will kill you. And anyone who tries to use her against me after this will learn the same lesson." The gunshots echoed in the warehouse, 2 precise shots that ended Viktor Kozlov's life without ceremony or hesitation. Alexander lowered the guns, looked around at the bodies scattered across the concrete floor, at the blood and the waste and the consequence of crossing him, and then finally looked at her. She was shaking, crying. Silent tears again, because that's how she'd learned to grieve, but this time from shock and fear, and the terrible knowledge of what he was capable of, what he'd done to save her. He moved toward her, holstering the guns, and when he reached her, he pulled a knife from somewhere and cut her zip ties with hands that were steady despite the violence they'd just committed. "Caroline," he said, and his voice was different now, human again, filled with desperate concern and something that looked like guilt. "Are you hurt? Did they hurt you?" She couldn't answer, could only stare at him, at this man who'd just killed 5 people without blinking, who'd walked through gunfire like it was rain, who looked at her now with eyes that begged her to understand, to forgive, to not run from what she'd just witnessed. "I'm sorry," he whispered, reaching for her face with hands that were stained with blood, then pulling back when he realized, wiping them on his suit jacket like he could erase what he'd done. "I'm so sorry you had to see that. I'm sorry I wasn't faster, wasn't there before they took you. I'm sorry for all of it, Caroline, for bringing this darkness into your life, for making you a target, for being exactly the monster you were afraid I was." "You killed them," she whispered, finding her voice finally, though it came out broken and small. "You just killed them all, Alexander, without hesitation, without mercy." "Yes," he said simply, not trying to justify or explain, just accepting the truth of what he was. "I did. And I would do it again. Every time. Because the alternative was letting them hurt you, letting them use you against me, letting them think that you were weak enough to be a weapon. I won't let anyone hurt you, Caroline. Not ever. Even if it means showing you the parts of me I wanted to keep hidden, even if it means proving that I am exactly what you feared." She should have run, should have told him to stay away, to never contact her again, to let her return to her safe, careful, alone existence. But looking at him now, at the blood on his clothes, and the desperation in his eyes, and the raw need to know that she didn't hate him, wouldn't leave him, could somehow still see the man who read Russian poetry behind the killer who'd just massacred 5 people to save her, she realized something terrible. She realized she loved him anyway. Loved him despite the violence, despite the fear, despite every rational reason to walk away. Loved him because he'd looked at her crying in silence and decided she was worth risking everything for. Because he treated her like something precious in a world that had told her she was past her expiration date. Because when she looked at him, she didn't see a monster. She saw someone as broken and lonely as she was, someone trying desperately to be better than what life had made him. "Take me home," she said finally, and she saw relief flood his face, saw him understand that home meant his home, not hers, that she wasn't running, wasn't leaving, was choosing to stay despite everything. He did. Took her to his house on the hill, past security that reported in hushed voices, past staff who looked at her with knowing eyes and brought them both blankets and hot tea and left them alone in his library with the fire burning low. He showered while she sat wrapped in warmth, changed into clean clothes that didn't carry the evidence of murder, and when he returned, he knelt before her like a supplicant before a saint, his hands shaking finally, the adrenaline wearing off and leaving him vulnerable and afraid. "I understand if you can't do this," he said, his voice rough with emotion he'd been holding back. "If you can't be with someone who does what I do, who lives in violence even when trying to escape it. I understand if tonight was too much, if seeing what I'm really capable of broke whatever was growing between us. But I need you to know, Caroline, I need you to understand that I never wanted you to see that. Never wanted you to know what I become when someone threatens what's mine. I wanted to keep that separate, to protect you from it, to let you believe I could be just a man who liked books and had dinner with you and maybe, eventually, could be something other than what I was." She reached out, touched his face, felt the wetness there and realized he was crying. This dangerous man was crying, and the sight broke something in her chest. Some last defense against feeling too much. "I'm terrified," she admitted. "Terrified of you, of what you do, of the world you live in. Terrified that loving you means accepting violence and danger and the possibility that one day you won't come home because someone finally was faster or smarter or had better aim. Terrified that I'm not strong enough for this, that I'm just a school teacher who reads books and grades papers and has no business being in love with a man who kills people." "You're in love with me?" he asked, and his voice held wonder and fear in equal measure. "Yes," she whispered. "God help me. Yes. I'm in love with you, Aleksander. I love you despite my terror, despite my better judgment, despite knowing that this can only end badly. I love you because you saw me crying and decided I mattered. Because you've been patient and gentle and treated me like someone worth waiting for. Because underneath all the violence and danger, I see someone as lonely and broken as I am. Someone trying so hard to be better even when better seems impossible." He surged up then, caught her face in his hands, and kissed her like he was drowning and she was air, like she was salvation and mercy, and every good thing he'd thought he'd forfeited the right to. She kissed him back, poured 7 years of loneliness into that kiss, let him taste her fear and her need and her desperate hope that somehow they could make this work, could build something real in the spaces between his darkness and her light. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, both trembling with want and restraint, he rested his forehead against hers. "I will protect you," he promised. "With everything I have, everything I am, I will keep you safe. No one will hurt you again, Caroline. I swear it on my life, on everything I've built, on every dark thing I've done. You are mine now, and I take care of what's mine." "I know," she whispered. "That's what terrifies me most." That night she stayed, slept in his bed while he held her like she might disappear, like she was something fragile and impossibly precious. They didn't make love, both understanding that some barriers needed to stay in place a while longer, that physical intimacy would come when emotional intimacy had settled into certainty. But being held was enough. Being wanted was enough. Being chosen, being claimed, being told she mattered to someone who could have had anyone and chose her, that was more than enough. The next few weeks were complicated. Victor's death had consequences. Meetings with the council Aleksander had dismissed so easily, negotiations and threats, and the careful dance of power maintaining itself. He came to her sometimes with weariness in every line of his body, sat in her classroom while she graded papers and told her things he probably shouldn't, about the business, about the decisions he had to make, about the weight of commanding an empire built on fear. She listened, asked questions, slowly learned the language of his world even as she remained firmly in hers. The school administration was less forgiving. The principal called her in again, this time with the superintendent, and they asked direct questions about Aleksander Volkov, about his business dealings, about whether she understood what it meant for the school's reputation to have a teacher involved with someone like him. She told them the truth, that she loved him, that he'd saved her life, that whatever he did outside her classroom didn't change the fact that she was an excellent teacher who dedicated 15 years to their students. They put her on probationary status anyway, told her they'd be watching, that any scandal, any connection between her personal life and her professional duties would result in immediate termination. She accepted their terms. What choice did she have? Teaching was her life, her identity beyond being Aleksander's. But the threat hung over her, heavy and constant, a reminder that loving him came with prices she hadn't fully calculated. He noticed her stress, the way she came to him with tension in her shoulders, exhaustion in her eyes. "Leave it," he said one evening when she was grading papers in his library, her red pen moving with automated precision. Leave the job. Let me take care of you. You don't need to work, Caroline. I have more money than I could spend in 10 lifetimes. You could stay here, read your books, be free from their judgments and their threats. No, she said firmly, looking up at him with determination that surprised them both. I won't be kept, Alexander. Won't be a trophy or a possession or someone who gave up everything for a man, no matter how much I love him. My job, my independence, my identity as something other than your girlfriend, those things matter. I need to know I can survive without you, that I'm choosing you rather than depending on you. He was quiet for a moment, then nodded slowly. You're right, he said. I'm sorry. I forget sometimes that strength comes in forms other than power and money. Your independence, your refusal to be anything other than yourself, those are the things I love most about you. I don't want to take them away, even when I'm trying to protect you. She smiled, reached for his hand across the table. Then don't. Protect me. Yes. Love me. Absolutely. But let me remain Caroline Warren, literature teacher, even as I'm becoming something else, someone who loves you. Spring came slowly that year. Winter. Reluctant to release its grip on the city, Caroline continued teaching, continued grading papers and discussing Fitzgerald and Hemingway with students who would never know about the nights she spent in a mansion on a hill with a man who ran an empire from shadows. Alexander continued his business, continued making decisions that involved violence she didn't ask about, protection she didn't want to need, compromises with morality she couldn't quite accept but had learned to live with. They fell into rhythm, these two broken people learning to move together. Quiet dinners where he cooked for her because he'd learned she loved it when he did. Valued the intimacy of shared meals more than expensive restaurants. Mornings where she corrected his English pronunciation while he taught her Russian phrases, both of them laughing at their mistakes, finding joy in small moments of learning each other. Evenings where they read side by side in his library, comfortable in silence, occasionally reading passages aloud to share something beautiful or profound. Nights where he held her and told her his fears, his doubts, his desperate wish that he could be someone different, someone worthy of the light she brought into his darkness. And slowly, carefully, they began to build toward something more. Touches that lingered longer, kisses that deepened with need, moments where the restraint between them felt less like protection and more like denial. Caroline found herself wanting him with an intensity that surprised her, that made her feel young and reckless and alive in ways she'd forgotten were possible. He wanted her too. She could see it in the way his eyes darkened when she moved close, the way his hands trembled slightly when he touched her face, the way his voice roughened when he told her she was beautiful, desirable, everything he'd ever wanted in a way that had nothing to do with strategy or power. One evening in late April, with rain falling soft against the windows and the fire burning low in his library, something shifted. She'd been reading, curled in the chair that had become hers, wearing one of his shirts over her jeans because she liked how it smelled like him, liked the casual intimacy of wearing his clothes. He'd been working at his desk, managing something to do with shipments and territories, but she could feel his attention on her, could sense the weight of his gaze every time she turned a page. "Caroline," he said finally, his voice rough with barely controlled need. "Come here." She set down her book, moved toward him with a certainty she'd earned over months of learning to trust him. Trust this. Trust that love could exist in spaces between light and darkness. He pulled her onto his lap, held her close, and when he kissed her, there was nothing gentle or careful about it. It was hunger, raw and desperate, months of restraint breaking like a dam giving way to flood. "I want you," he said against her mouth, his hands moving over her, back, her sides, touching her with reverent intensity. "I've wanted you since that first night in the parking lot when you stood there with your keys between your fingers like a weapon, ready to fight me despite your fear. I want you so badly it's destroying me, Caroline, but I need you to be sure, need you to know what it means, to choose this completely, to let me have all of you knowing what I am and what I've done." "I'm sure," she whispered, surprised by her own certainty, by how much she wanted this, wanted him, wanted to finally erase the last distance between them. "I love you, Alexander. Not despite what you are, but including it. All of you. The darkness and the light, the violence and the gentleness, the man who kills and the man who reads poetry. I choose all of it. I choose you." He stood, lifting her with him, and carried her through the house to his bedroom, where moonlight fell across white sheets like blessing or warning, where he undressed her slowly, reverently, his hands shaking with the magnitude of what they were about to share. She undressed him too, seeing for the first time the scars that covered his body. Evidence of violence survived, proof that he was mortal despite the way he moved through danger like he was untouchable. She traced those scars with gentle fingers, kissed each one, mourning the pain they represented while grateful they'd led him to survive long enough to find her. When they finally came together, it was with a tenderness that broke her heart, with a passion that consumed them both, with a completeness that felt like two incomplete people finally creating something whole. He moved inside her with careful intensity, watching her face, learning what made her gasp, what made her cry out, what made her arch against him with desperate need. She gave herself to him completely, let him see her vulnerable and wanting and falling apart in his arms, let him understand that this was trust, absolute trust, the kind that came from choosing danger and finding safety instead. Afterwards, wrapped in sheets and each other, she cried. Not from pain or regret, but from relief, from joy, from the overwhelming emotion of being seen and chosen and loved by someone who understood loneliness with the same intimacy she did. He held her through it, stroked her hair, whispered Russian endearments she didn't fully understand, but felt the meaning of in every cell of her body. "I love you," he said in English, then in Russian, then in the language of touches and kisses that needed no translation. "I will always love you, Caroline. You are everything I never knew I needed, everything I thought I'd sacrifice the right to have. You are light in darkness, hope in despair, proof that even damaged things can be worth something." "We're worth something," she corrected gently, "not despite being damaged, but because of it. Because we understand what it means to survive, to keep going when everything hurts, to build walls and then, brave enough to let them fall. We're worth something together, Alexander. Both of us." Summer came, bringing heat that made the city shimmer and slow. Caroline finished the school year with her job intact. Barely. The administration still watching her, but unable to find fault with her teaching, her dedication, her absolute commitment to her students. Alexander's business continued, quieter now, more carefully managed, as if he was trying to find ways to be legitimate without giving up the power that kept him safe, kept her safe. They talked about the future sometimes, carefully, both afraid to want too much, to assume too much permanence in something built on such unstable ground. But then everything changed again. It was a Tuesday in July, hot and sticky, and Caroline was at school preparing for summer classes when her phone rang. An unknown number, which she normally wouldn't answer, but something made her pick up. Some instinct that said this mattered. "Caroline Warren?" A woman's voice, official and careful. "Yes?" "This is Dr. Sarah Chen from Metropolitan Hospital. You're listed as the emergency contact for Aleksander Volkov. I'm calling to inform you that Mr. Volkov has been admitted to our facility following an incident. You should come immediately." The world tilted. She dropped the phone, grabbed her keys, ran to her car with her heart trying to tear itself from her chest. The drive to the hospital was a blur of traffic and terror, her mind supplying 1,000 terrible images of what incident might mean, how badly he might be hurt, whether she'd arrive to find him dying or already gone. She'd known this was possible. Had known from the beginning that loving a man like Aleksander meant accepting that violence could take him from her without warning, without mercy, without giving her time to prepare. The emergency room was chaos, but she pushed through, demanding to see him, refusing to be moved or calmed or processed through normal procedures. Finally, a doctor appeared, young and tired, with blood on her scrubs that made Caroline's stomach turn. "Miss Warren? I'm Dr. Rodriguez. Mr. Volkov is in surgery. He was shot 3 times, chest, abdomen, and shoulder. The surgery is ongoing, will be for several more hours. He's critical but stable, which means he's fighting. I need you to wait, to let us work. Can you do that?" She couldn't. But she did. Sat in the waiting room for 8 hours while surgeons fought to save the man she loved, while nurses gave her updates that meant nothing, while time crawled by with cruel slowness. Other people came, hard-faced men in expensive suits who looked at her with barely concealed curiosity, who whispered in corners and made phone calls and seemed to be planning responses to whatever had happened. She didn't care about them. Didn't care about the business or the empire or anything except whether Aleksander would survive. Finally, Dr. Rodriguez emerged, still in scrubs, exhaustion making her look older than her years. "He's alive," she said, and Caroline's legs gave out, would have collapsed if the doctor hadn't caught her. "He's alive, Miss Warren. The surgery went as well as we could have hoped. He's critical. Will be in ICU for days at least. But he's alive. He's a fighter, that one. Survived things that should have killed him." "Can I see him?" Caroline asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Briefly. He's sedated. Won't wake for hours, but yes. You can see him." They led her through corridors to the ICU, to a room where machines beeped and tubes ran from his body to bags of fluid and blood. Aleksander lay there looking both peaceful and broken, his face pale, his chest rising and falling with mechanical assistance, and she thought about how strange it was to see someone so powerful rendered helpless, to see violence finally catch up with danger, to know that even he couldn't outrun mortality forever. She sat beside his bed, took his hand carefully around the IV line, and waited. For hours, for days, for however long it took. The men in suits came and went, bringing updates she didn't understand, asking questions she couldn't answer. The doctors updated her regularly, told her he was improving, that his body was responding well, that he would survive though recovery would be long and painful. She barely heard them. Just sat holding his hand, watching his face, willing him to wake up, to come back to her, to prove that love was stronger than bullets and violence and the darkness that had finally found him. On the 3rd day, his eyes opened, clouded with pain medication, confused and disoriented, but aware enough to see her, to recognize her, to squeeze her hand with a strength that said he was still there, still fighting, still hers. "Caroline," he rasped, his voice rough from the breathing tube they'd removed that morning. "You're here." "Where else would I be?" she asked, and she was crying again, those silent tears that he'd first noticed months ago, but now they were relief instead of pain, joy instead of grief. "You got yourself shot, you idiot. You promised to keep yourself safe, to protect what was yours, and that includes you. You're mine too, Aleksander. Mine to protect just as much as I'm yours." He tried to smile, winced at the pain it caused. "Tried to keep you out of this," he said. "Tried to keep the danger away from you. Failed at that, didn't I?" "You didn't fail," she said firmly. "You survived. You fought, and you survived. And that's all I care about. The rest? The business? The violence? The danger? We'll figure it out. Together. But you don't get to die on me, Aleksander Volkov. You don't get to make me fall in love with you, and then leave me alone again. I won't allow it. He laughed, then groaned, the movement pulling at his wounds. Bossy, he said. When did you get so bossy? When someone tried to take you from me? She said, and her voice was steel now. All the fear and worry and helpless, waiting, transforming into determination. When I realized I'm not ready to go back to being alone, to being the woman who never smiled, to being safe and careful and empty. You did that, Aleksander. You taught me what it feels like to want something badly enough to fight for it. So I'm fighting. For you. For us. For whatever future we can build together despite everything trying to destroy it. He closed his eyes, squeezed her hand. I love you, he whispered. So much it terrifies me. So much that getting shot felt worth it if it meant keeping you safe. You didn't get shot protecting me, she pointed out gently. You got shot because you live a dangerous life. So maybe, when you're recovered, when you're strong enough, we talk about changing that. About finding ways to step back from the violence, to build something different. I'm not asking you to become someone you're not, Aleksander. But I'm asking you to try to be someone who might live long enough to grow old with me. He opened his eyes again, looked at her with something close to wonder. Old with you, he repeated. That's what you want? To grow old with me? Yes, she said simply. That's exactly what I want. Ridiculous, isn't it? A middle-aged schoolteacher and a mafia boss, growing old together. But I want it anyway. Want mornings and evenings and all the boring, beautiful moments in between. Want to see your hair go completely gray. Want to argue about what to have for dinner. Want to fall asleep reading while you work late. Want every mundane, ordinary day that people take for granted. I want a life with you, Aleksander. Not despite the danger, but beyond it. A life where we both survive long enough to see what happens next. He was crying now, tears sliding down his face, and she leaned forward, kissed them away, tasted salt and pain and hope. I'll try, he promised. I'll try to give you that, Caroline, to be the man who grows old with you instead of the man who dies young and violent. I'll try to find ways to step back, to delegate, to build something sustainable instead of something that requires my constant involvement in danger. I'll try because you're asking, and because I can't imagine anything I want more than those boring, beautiful moments with you. Recovery was slow. Weeks in the hospital, then months of physical therapy, pain management, learning to move again without triggering agony from wounds that had nearly killed him. Caroline was there through all of it, taking leave from school, spending her days by his side, her nights in his hospital room where she slept in uncomfortable chairs and woke when he cried out from nightmares, held his hand through procedures that made him want to quit, reminded him why surviving mattered when the pain made him forget. The men in suits came less frequently, and she learned that Aleksander was making changes, had used his recovery as an opportunity to restructure, to promote people he trusted to handle the daily operations, to step back from the front lines of violence and danger. It wasn't retirement, wasn't even close to legitimate, but it was movement in the right direction, was an attempt to build something that might let them have the future she demanded in that hospital room. Fall came again, a year after they'd met in that parking lot, a year since she'd stopped smiling and started living. She returned to school, returned to teaching literature to students who asked carefully about Mr. Volkov, who'd heard rumors about what happened, who looked at her differently now, like she'd survived something dramatic and emerged transformed. She was no longer the woman who never smiled, who hid behind routine and safety, who convinced herself that being alone was preferable to being vulnerable. She was Caroline Warren, who loved a dangerous man and learned to live with the fear, who chose possibility over certainty, who smiled now because she had something worth smiling about. One evening in October, exactly 1 year after their first dinner, Alexander took her back to that hillside mansion, to the room where they'd first shared a meal, where she'd first seen the books with cracked spines and known he was more than the dangerous reputation that preceded him. He'd recovered enough to walk without pain, to move with something approaching his old grace, though scars now marked his body as surely as the ones she'd kissed that first night they made love. "I have something to ask you," he said, and there was nervousness in his voice, uncertainty she'd rarely heard. "Something I've been thinking about since that hospital room when you told me you wanted to grow old together." He knelt then, this man who commanded empires, who'd killed to protect her, who'd survived bullets and violence and the darkness of his own choices, knelt before her like she was something holy, something worth worshipping. From his pocket, he pulled a ring, simple and elegant, a single diamond set in platinum that caught the light like a promise. "Marry me, Caroline," he said, and his voice shook with the magnitude of what he was asking. "Marry me knowing exactly who I am and what I've done. Marry me knowing that danger will always be part of our lives, that my past will never completely release me, that loving me means choosing fear and hope in equal measure. Marry me because you've made me believe that even damaged things can build something worth having, that even people like us deserve happiness. Marry me and let's grow old together, boring and beautiful and alive." She should have been careful, should have considered the implications, the continued risks, the reality that marrying into his world meant accepting things she'd never fully be comfortable with. Should have thought about her job, her independence, her carefully constructed identity as someone separate from his darkness. But looking at him kneeling before her, this powerful man made vulnerable by love, this killer, who'd learned to be gentle, this survivor who'd chosen to keep surviving because she asked him to, she realized that careful was overrated, that some risks were worth taking, that love, real love that saw all your flaws and chose you anyway, was rare enough to deserve recklessness. "Yes," she said, and watched his face transform with joy, with relief, with love so pure it erased the violence and danger and left only the man who'd waited for her after school, who'd seen her crying and decided she mattered. "Yes, Alexander, I'll marry you. I'll grow old with you. I'll choose this beautiful, terrifying uncertainty every single day because the alternative is going back to safety. And safety without you isn't safety at all. It's just loneliness by another name." He slid the ring onto her finger, stood, pulled her into his arms with careful intensity, mindful of injuries still healing but unable to maintain distance. They kissed like they'd kissed 1,000 times before, but different too, weighted with promise, with future, with the knowledge that they were choosing each other not just for tonight, but for all the nights to come. "I love you," he whispered against her lips. "More than I've ever loved anything, more than power or money or empire. You are everything, Caroline, everything that matters." "I love you too," she said. "My dangerous, beautiful man who taught me to smile again." Outside the windows, the city spread below them like fallen stars, like possibilities, like all the tomorrows they'd fought so hard to earn. Inside, two people who should never have worked, who came from different worlds and different kinds of damage, held each other and believed, truly believed, that love could be enough. That choosing each other despite the danger, despite the fear, despite every rational reason to walk away, was the bravest thing either of them had ever done. And in the library where books lined the shelves, and a worn chair held the shape of her body, and Russian poetry waited to be read aloud on quiet evenings, life waited for them. Boring, beautiful life. Days that would fade into years, mornings and evenings and all the moments in between. Two souls who'd found each other in parking lots and hospitals, and the spaces where darkness met light. Learning what it meant to be chosen, to be loved, to be enough exactly as they were. The woman who never smiled had learned to laugh. The man who dealt in violence had learned to be gentle. And together, they built something rare in a world of compromises and careful choices. They built truth. They built trust. They built a love that acknowledged fear and chose hope anyway, that saw the darkness and found light worth fighting for, that understood survival and decided it was only meaningful if you survived together. That's what they whispered in the hallways of Jefferson High after that, when students saw Miss Warren with a ring on her finger and a smile that transformed her face from severe to radiant. They said she'd found love late in life, that she'd met someone who saw past her walls, that even careful people could be reckless sometimes if the risk was worth taking. They said the mysterious man still waited for her after school sometimes, leaning against his expensive car, watching her with eyes that held entire worlds of devotion, and that she walked toward him now without fear, without hesitation, with the confidence of someone who'd learned that the most dangerous thing you could do was also sometimes the most necessary. They said she'd learned to smile again. And watching her, seeing the joy that radiated from someone who'd spent years convincing herself that happiness was something other people deserved, they started to believe that maybe it wasn't too late for any of them. Maybe darkness recognized darkness not as mirror, but as match. Maybe loneliness called to loneliness not to stay lonely, but to finally come home. Follow for more dark romance stories and secrets. Because sometimes the most dangerous love affairs are the ones that teach us we were always worth saving. We're always deserving of someone who'd wait by our car in parking lots, who'd see us crying in silence and decide we mattered enough to risk everything. Sometimes the woman who never smiled finds the man who gives her reason to, and in that finding, discovers that being brave enough to want something dangerous is the only way to truly be alive.